Hello, friends. We are very interested to know which cities you are listening to us from, so quickly like and write in the comments where you are from. Also share what shocking stories happened in your city or maybe even with you personally. Subscribe because the next story could be about your city or even your personal drama. Now let's dive into a new exciting story. Tom sat at the kitchen table, staring at the plate of chicken casserole that Laura had prepared a couple of hours ago. Casserole was her signature dish, but today it seemed bland to him, as if Laura had forgotten to add spices. Or maybe it was just him. The tension between them hung in the air, thick as the Chicago fog that sometimes engulfed their suburban neighborhood. They hardly spoke, only the clatter of forks on plates disturbed the silence of their cozy kitchen with wooden cabinets and faded floral wallpaper. Laura, sitting opposite, picked at her food, her long brown hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked tired, but still beautiful, the kind of beauty that had once made Tom fall in love with her in his freshman year of college. Her green eyes, usually sparkling, were dull today, and Tom couldn't tell whether it was because of fatigue or something else. He cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound casual. Laura looked up and smiled slightly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She put down her fork and reached for a glass of water. "Fine. Another deadline. Ryan has been pushing everyone with this new campaign again," she said, taking a sip. "And you?" Tom shrugged. His job as an engineer in a construction company was stable but boring. Every day he checked drawings, coordinated projects, and drank disgusting coffee from the machine in the office. Nothing that would interest Laura, who had always been passionate about her career in marketing. As usual, the boss is again demanding that the design for the bridge on 94th be redesigned. He says the budget was cut, he answered, looking at her. "Who is Ryan?" Laura tensed slightly, but immediately relaxed, as if she had caught herself doing it. She waved her hand as if to ward off his question. "Oh, just a colleague. New guy on the team. He is responsible for creativity in this project. A little too energetic, but smart," she said, returning to her casserole. Tom nodded, but something in her tone made him wary. She had mentioned Ryan several times over the past weeks, always with a slight smile that now seemed suspicious to him. He tried to brush the thought aside. Laura never gave cause for jealousy, and yet, something was wrong. "You came back late today," he noted, trying not to sound accusing. "Are you late again?" Laura sighed, leaning back in her chair. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the tablecloth. "Yes, Tom, I told you that we have an emergency situation. This campaign for a sports brand is a huge contract. If we take her down, heads will roll." "Mine included," she said, and there was slight irritation in her voice. "You know how it happens." "I know," Tom nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than necessary. He noticed that she was not looking into his eyes, but was instead intently studying the pattern on the tablecloth. "It's just, you look tired. Maybe it's worth taking a couple of days." Laura laughed, but it was harsh, almost sarcastic. "Take a couple of days? Tom, are you serious? I have a deadline in a week, and Ryan has already made a ton of appointments. Tomorrow, by the way, we will have dinner with him. We need to discuss a presentation for a client," she said, finally looking up. "No big deal, just work." Tom froze, his fork hanging in the air. Dinner? With Ryan? His brain immediately began to draw pictures. Laura in an elegant dress, laughing at the jokes of some clean-shaven marketer with a perfect smile. He swallowed, trying to suppress his irritation. "Dinner?" he asked again, trying not to let his voice betray his emotions. "You mean business?" Laura rolled her eyes, but her cheeks turned slightly pink. "Yes, Tom, businesslike. What else? Ryan and I have to prepare the final version of the pitch." He suggested meeting at a restaurant to calmly discuss everything. "There's always someone distracting you in the office," she said, her tone becoming a little harsher. "It's not a party, if that's what you mean." Tom felt something hot boiling in his chest, but he forced himself to smile. The last thing he wanted was an argument. They had been arguing too often lately, and each time it ended with Laura going to bed in the living room and him lying in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling and replaying in his head where everything had gone wrong. "I was just asking," he said, raising his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "You know, I don't mind if it's work." Laura looked at him, her gaze softened, but there was still wariness in it. "I know," she answered quietly. "It's just, I'm really tired, Tom. Let's not start." He nodded, returning to his food, but his appetite was completely gone. The rest of dinner passed in silence, only the sound of the TV in the living room, where some kind of sports match was being played, filled the emptiness. Laura stood up to put the dishes away, and Tom noticed her sneak a glance at her phone before slipping it into her pocket. "I'll take a shower and go to bed," she said without looking at him. "Tomorrow is a hard day." "Of course," Tom replied, watching her leave the kitchen. Her steps were light, almost hasty, as if she wanted to get away from him as quickly as possible. He remained sitting at the table, looking at the empty plate. The same question was running through my head: who is Ryan? And why does Laura act so strange when she talks about him? Tom shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. He trusted Laura. They had been married for 7 years, had gone through a move, a job loss, even a pregnancy loss 3 years ago that nearly destroyed their marriage. She wouldn't. Or would she? Tom stood up to load the dishwasher, but his eyes fell on Laura's phone, which she had left on the counter. The screen was off, but he knew her password. Just a couple of seconds, and he could check her messages, her calls. He froze, his hand hovering over the phone. His heart was pounding as if he was about to commit a crime. "No," he muttered to himself, moving away from the counter. "This is stupid." But doubt had already taken root. He knew he couldn't just forget about it. Dinner with Ryan. Business meeting. For some reason, those words sounded like lies in his head, although he couldn't explain why. Tom turned off the light in the kitchen and headed into the living room. The TV was still on, showing an advertisement for some beer. He sat down on the sofa, but his thoughts were far away. He remembered how Laura looked today, her neatly painted lips, her slightly more revealing blouse than usual. It wasn't for him. Then for whom? "Stop it," he said out loud, rubbing his temples. "You're pushing yourself too hard." But the voice in his head was louder. He remembered Laura laughing when she talked about Ryan a couple of weeks ago. She called him charismatic. It didn't seem important then, but now everything looked different. Tom took the remote control and turned off the TV. Silence fell over him like a heavy blanket. He sat in the dark, listening to the water running in the bathroom where Laura was taking a shower. He tried to remember the last time they were truly close. Not just physically, but emotionally. A month ago? 2? Their conversations had long been reduced to discussing bills, work, plans for the weekend, which they rarely carried out. He stood up and headed to the bedroom. The bed was neatly made, as Laura always did. Tom lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling. His thoughts circled around the same thing: Ryan. Dinner. Laura. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, he imagined her at a restaurant table, smiling at someone else. When Laura finally entered the bedroom, her hair was damp and her face was clean, without makeup. She looked vulnerable, almost like the girl in whom he fell in love with many years ago. But Tom couldn't bring himself to smile. "Are you okay?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Yes," he lied. "I'm just tired." Laura nodded but did not continue. She lay down next to him, but there was a gap between them, wider than their double bed. Tom listened to her breathing until it became even, signaling that she had fallen asleep. And he lay there, looking into the darkness, and tried to convince himself that everything would be fine. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the wooden floor of the bedroom. Tom stood at the bathroom mirror, shaving, but his movements were mechanical, and his thoughts were somewhere far away. Yesterday's conversation with Laura about her business dinner with Ryan left a taste in him that he couldn't shake. He ran the razor across his cheek, a little harder than necessary, and winced as the blade scraped the skin. Blood appeared as a small red dot, and he cursed under his breath, grabbing a towel. Sounds were coming from the bedroom. Laura was rummaging in the closet, humming something under her breath. This was unusual. She rarely sang in the mornings, especially lately, when their mornings began with silent coffee and hasty preparations for work. Tom wiped his face and left the bathroom, stopping in the doorway. Laura stood in front of the open closet, sorting through the dresses that hung in neat rows. There were already 2 blouses and a dark skirt on the bed, as if she couldn't choose. "You got up early today," Tom noted, trying to keep his voice neutral. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Laura turned around, startled slightly, as if she had not expected to see him. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and her face had no makeup, but she had already put on a gray dress that emphasized her figure. Tom couldn't help but notice that she rarely wore this dress, usually on special occasions. "Oh, yes," she replied, smiling. "We need to have time to prepare a couple of slides before work. It's going to be hot today, right?" She pointed to the window, where the sun was already promising a typical Chicago summer day, but Tom felt that her words sounded like an excuse. He nodded, but his gaze lingered on the dress. She was holding a black, low-cut dress that he'd once called too daring for an office party. "Is this for work?" he asked, pointing to the dress. His tone was light, but everything inside tightened. Laura looked at the dress, then at him, and her smile wavered slightly. "Well, not really. This is for dinner," she said, hanging the dress back in the closet and picking up another blouse, a more formal one. "I want to look professional. Ryan said that the restaurant is quite pretentious, so you have to live up to it." Tom felt his throat tighten. He forced himself to smile, but it came out forced. "Pretentious, then," he repeated, going to the chest of drawers to take out a clean shirt. "What kind of place?" Laura shrugged, her fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of her blouse. "Some Italian restaurants in the center. La Vida, or something like that." "Ryan chose, he was already there," she answered, turning to the mirror. She began to comb her hair, but her movements were abrupt, as if she was in a hurry to end the conversation. Tom nodded silently, but images were already spinning in his head. Laura in this black dress, sitting at a table in the dim candlelight, opposite some Ryan who probably wears expensive suits and smells of $100 cologne. He tried to push these thoughts away, but they clung like burrs. "You look studious today," he said, unable to resist. He immediately regretted his words because Laura froze, her hand with the comb stopped. "Diligently?" she asked, turning to him. Her eyebrows raised, and there was a hint of mockery in her voice. "Is this a compliment or a hint?" Tom raised his hands as if in surrender. "A compliment, Laura, a compliment," he said, but his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. "I just noticed that you're paying a lot of attention to this dinner." Laura rolled her eyes, but her cheeks turned slightly pink. She turned to the mirror and began applying foundation, her movements fast, almost annoyed. "Tom, this is an important meeting. If we impress the client, it could be a huge boost for my career. Ryan, he knows how to present a project, but I have to be on top of it," she said, her voice becoming firmer. "Not everything revolves around what I look like." Tom opened his mouth to answer, but thought better of it. He felt that anything he said would only make the situation worse. Instead, he began to get dressed, pulling on a shirt and trousers. But his gaze kept returning to Laura, who was now standing at the dressing table, applying mascara. She did this with such care, as if she was preparing for a date, and not for a business meeting. The thought stung him, and he turned away, concentrating on fastening his buttons. "Are you late today, too?" Laura asked without looking up from the mirror. Her voice was calm, but Tom detected a slight tension in it. "No," he answered, tying his tie. "An ordinary day. Maybe I'll even come back early. Would you like us to order something for dinner? If you're at home, of course." The last words came out of their own accord, and he immediately regretted them. Laura looked at him through the mirror, her eyes narrowed. "If I'm at home?" she asked, her tone becoming colder. "Tom, I told you, I'm having dinner with Ryan. I don't know what time I'll be back. It depends on how much we discuss. I understand, he said quickly, raising his hands. I just thought that. Well, never mind. Forget. Laura sighed, put down her mascara, and turned to him. Her face softened, but there was still wariness in her eyes. Listen, I know we've been not in the best shape lately, she said, searching for words, but it's just a job, Tom. Nothing more. I don't want you to think. Something unnecessary. Tom looked at her, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Her words sounded sincere, but something in her posture, in the way she avoided his gaze, made him doubt. I don't think anything extra, he lied, forcing a smile. Just be careful, okay? Laura smiled, but the smile was tired. I will, she said, returning to her makeup. Don't worry. Tom nodded, but the excitement did not go away. He finished getting dressed, grabbed his briefcase, and headed towards the door. But before leaving, he turned around. Laura was now wearing lipstick, a bright red that she only wore on special occasions. His stomach clenched. Have a nice day, he said, trying to keep his voice even. And you, she answered, without looking up from the mirror. Tom left the bedroom, closing the door behind him. On the way to the car, he tried to convince himself that it was all nonsense, that he was just fooling himself. Laura was right, it's just a job. But the image of her in that black dress, with red lipstick, sitting opposite Ryan, could not leave my head. He got into the car, started the engine, and drove out onto the road, but his thoughts were occupied with only one thing. Something was wrong. Tom was distracted all day in the office. He sat at his desk, checking the drawings, but his eyes kept returning to the phone. He was waiting for a message from Laura, some banal, everything is okay, or I'm delayed, but the screen remained blank. By lunchtime, he could not stand it and wrote to her himself. How are you? Is everything okay with the presentation? The answer came half an hour later, short and dry. Yes, everything is fine. Busy. We'll talk in the evening. Tom stared at the message, feeling his heart clench. He knew that Laura was often harsh when she was busy, but today her words seemed cold and distant to him. He put the phone face down and tried to concentrate on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to her and to Ryan. At the end of the working day, Tom felt exhausted, although he had not done anything special. He gathered his things and headed to the car, deciding to stop at the grocery store on the way home. Maybe if he cooks something special, Laura will come back earlier and they can talk properly. But even this thought seemed naive to him. He knew that tonight Laura would not be with him, but with Ryan in this damn pretentious restaurant, and from these thoughts, his fists clenched on the steering wheel. When he arrived at the house, the sun was already setting, turning the sky orange and pink. He entered the empty house, threw the keys on the table in the hallway and froze. The silence was deafening. He imagined Laura already in the restaurant, laughing at some of Ryan's jokes, her eyes sparkling in the candlelight. This picture was so vivid that he almost felt its reality. Tom sat down on the couch, turning on the TV to drown out his thoughts. But even the noise of a sports match could not drown out the voice in his head. Dark the streets of downtown Chicago sparkled with lights reflected in the windows of expensive boutiques and the glass facades of skyscrapers. Laura got out of the taxi, straightening the black dress that she had chosen for dinner. The cool evening breeze touched her shoulders, and she pulled her light cloak tighter. La Vida, with its warm light streaming through the windows and its Italian-style sign, looked exactly as Ryan had described, elegant without being flashy. Laura took a deep breath, trying to calm the slight excitement that she could not explain, and stepped towards the entrance. Inside, she was greeted by the aroma of fresh pasta and herbs, mixed with the muffled hum of conversations and the clink of glasses. The hostess, a young girl in a strict black dress, smiled and led Laura to a table in the corner where Ryan was already sitting. He stood up when he noticed her, and his face lit up with a wide smile. Ryan was tall, with dark hair that was slightly unkempt, and wore a dark blue suit that looked like it was tailored just for him. His confidence, bordering on slight arrogance, always stood out in the office, and now it seemed even more noticeable. "Laura, you look amazing," he said, pulling out a chair for her. His voice was warm, with a slight hoarseness that made his compliments especially convincing. Laura smiled, feeling her cheeks warm slightly. She sat down, straightening her dress, and tried to focus on the purpose of the meeting. "Thank you," she replied, trying to make her voice sound professional. "You, too, fit in with the situation." Ryan laughed as he sat down opposite him. His eyes, dark and attentive, lingered on her a little longer than necessary, but Laura pretended not to notice. "This place is one of my favorites," he said, opening the menu. "The food here is great, but the main thing is the atmosphere. Calm down, you can talk about business without office noise." Laura nodded, revealing her menu, although her thoughts were slightly scattered. She felt a little out of place, not because of Ryan, but because of how strange Tom had been acting this morning. His questions, his gaze, full of unspoken suspicions, were still spinning in her head. She pushed those thoughts away, reminding herself that it was just dinner. Working dinner. So, she began, taking a tablet with a presentation from her bag. "I reviewed the slides you sent yesterday. I think we should increase the emphasis on the emotional component of the brand. The client wants it to be not just about sneakers, but about inspiration." Ryan nodded, but his gaze was more on her than on the tablet. "I agree," he said, drinking from a glass of water that the waiter had just placed on the table. "But I think that we are already close to ideal. Your idea of the runner stories is really catchy. You always know how to find the right angle." Laura felt a slight warmth from his words. Ryan was known around the office for being able to give compliments that sounded sincere, but now his tone seemed a little more personal. She smiled, trying to bring the conversation back to business. "Well, it's a team effort," she said, opening a slide with graphs. "Here I added data about the target audience. If we—" "Laura," Ryan interrupted, leaning a little closer. His voice became quieter, almost conspiratorial. "Let's forget about the slides for a moment. All we do all day in the office is discuss charts and numbers. Tell me something. Not about work." Laura hesitated, her fingers frozen on the tablet screen. She looked at him, trying to figure out whether he was joking or not. His smile was light, but there was something else in his eyes, an interest that went beyond the professional. "What, for example?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "My life is not that exciting." Ryan laughed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't believe it," he said with a wink. "You have an aura. You're always so collected, but I'm sure there's something interesting hidden behind that. Well, tell me, what do you do when you're not saving our projects?" Laura felt her heart speed up slightly. She wasn't sure if she liked this turn of conversation or was scared, but something in his manner, easy, almost playful, made her relax. "Well," she began, putting the tablet aside, "I like to run. Not like these clients of ours who train for marathons, but I go to the park a couple times a week. This helps clear your head." Ryan raised his eyebrows, clearly interested. "Seriously? Runner?" he said, smiling. "We need to organize a race somehow." "True, I'm more into the gym, but I can try. Just don't laugh if I fall behind." Laura laughed, and the tension she had felt eased a little. The conversation became easier, and she found herself liking it. Ryan was charming, and his attention, although slightly unsettling, was pleasant. Meanwhile, in their suburban home, Tom was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV screen where some action movie was playing, but he was not following the plot. His phone lay on the coffee table, and he glanced at it every now and then as if waiting for Laura to text. But the screen remained dark. He had already sent her a message a couple of hours ago, but there was no response, and this only made him more worried. Tom stood up, walked around the living room, then headed to the kitchen to pour himself some water. But instead, he opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of beer, and returned to the sofa. He took a sip, but even the cold drink did not help to calm the irritation that was growing inside. Why doesn't she answer? Is it so difficult to send a few words? He took the phone and opened their correspondence. The last message from Laura was in the morning. "Busy. We'll talk in the evening." Tom frowned as he scrolled through their chat. She used to text him more often, even during work meetings, short messages like, "I miss you," or "I'll be late for an hour." And now nothing. He put the phone back on the table, but his hand immediately reached for it again. He opened the app, where Laura sometimes marked her locations, but her status was offline. Tom cursed under his breath, feeling stupid. He didn't want to be the guy who spies on his wife, but her behavior all haunted him. At the restaurant, Laura and Ryan had already ordered food, and the conversation smoothly flowed from work to more personal topics. The waiter brought them wine, and Ryan raised his glass. "For a successful project," he said, looking into her eyes, "and for good company." Laura smiled as she clinked glasses with him. The wine was soft, with fruity notes, and she felt a warmth spreading through her body. She knew she should bring the conversation back to work, but something about the atmosphere, the dim lights, the soft music, Ryan's gaze made it harder than she expected. "Tell me about yourself," she said, deciding to seize the initiative. "Are you always so energetic?" Ryan laughed, taking a sip of his wine. "Energetic? Is this a compliment?" he asked with a wink. "Well, let's just say I like it when everything moves. Work, life, everything. And you? You seem so balanced. How do you cope with this crazy rhythm?" Laura shrugged, looking at her glass. "Sometimes I don't know myself," she admitted. "The last months have been difficult. Lots of work, little time for yourself." She paused, realizing that she had almost mentioned Tom, but Ryan didn't seem to notice her pause. "I understand," he said, his voice becoming softer. "You know, sometimes you just need to stop and allow yourself a little joy. Like today, good food, good company. What could be better?" Laura nodded, but her smile was a little less confident. She felt a slight pang of guilt remembering Tom. He's probably sitting at home, waiting for her, and she's here, drinking wine with Ryan and laughing at his jokes. But it's just dinner, right? At home, Tom picked up the phone again and dialed her number. The beeps came one after another, but Laura did not answer. He dropped the call, feeling his irritation turn into something worse. He stood up, walked around the room, then returned to the sofa. The clock on the wall showed 9 in the evening. Dinner, that is. Business meeting. Why then did he feel as if his world was starting to fall apart at the seams? Midnight had long passed when Laura's key quietly clicked into the lock of the front door. The street outside the window of their suburban house was silent. Only the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog disturbed the night's peace. Inside the house, the light was dim, only the lamp in the living room was on, casting soft shadows on the walls. Tom was sitting in a chair, holding an empty bottle of beer in his hand, and on the coffee table in front of him was another half-full one. The TV was turned off, and there was a heavy silence in the room, interrupted only by the ticking of the wall clock. He did not sleep, although his eyes were red from fatigue. He spent the last 3 hours waiting, every now and then checking his phone, which never came to life with a single message from Laura. Her silence, her absence, her dinner with Ryan, all of this mixed in his head into a bitter cocktail of anxiety and irritation. He tried to distract himself, turned on the sports channel, flipped through the news, but his thoughts inevitably returned to her. To her and what she's doing in this damn restaurant. The sound of the door opening made him sit up straighter. Laura entered quietly, almost stealthily, as if she didn't want to wake him. She took off her coat, hung it on a hanger by the door, and only then noticed Tom sitting in a chair. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly pulled herself together, putting on a tired smile. "Oh, are you still awake?" she asked, her voice slightly hoarse, as if she was talking or laughing a lot. She put her bag on the floor and walked towards the kitchen, without looking him in the eyes. "I thought you'd been in bed for a long time." Tom was silent, watching her. Her black dress, the same one she had chosen in the morning, looked slightly wrinkled, and her hair, neatly styled in the morning, was now slightly disheveled. She looked alive, full of energy, despite the late hour. This only increased his irritation. "I can't sleep," he finally answered, his voice low, almost emotionless. He placed the empty bottle on the table and stood up, feeling his legs go numb. It's been a long time today. Laura paused at the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of water. Her shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't turn around. Yes, dinner has been delayed, she said, taking a sip. We discussed the project, then decided to sit a little longer to finalize a couple of ideas. Nothing special. Tom walked closer, stopping in the doorway between the living room and kitchen. He crossed his arms, trying to control himself, but his gaze involuntarily fell on her cloak hanging by the door. Something in the air, a subtle but foreign smell, made him frown. He stepped toward the coat rack, ostensibly to straighten his jacket, and leaned a little closer to Laura's coat. The smell was faint but distinct. Men's cologne with notes of sandalwood and something sharp and expensive. It wasn't his cologne. Nothing special then, he repeated, returning to her. His voice became a little harsher, although he tried to speak calmly. How was your night? Laura turned to him, holding the glass in her hands. Her eyes met his, but she quickly looked away, as if avoiding something. Okay, she replied, her tone light, but there was a sense of tension in it. Ryan and I finished the presentation. I think the client will be satisfied. He knows how to pitch an idea. Tom nodded, but his jaw clenched. Ryan. Again this name, pronounced with the same slight smile that appeared on her face in the morning when she talked about him. He took a step closer, trying to catch her gaze. So what, you talked about work all the time? He asked. His voice was even, but there was something in it that Laura couldn't help but notice. She placed the glass on the counter, her movements a little harsher than necessary. Her brows furrowed, and she finally looked at him, but there was irritation in her eyes. Tom, what kind of interrogation? She said, crossing her arms. Yes, we talked about work. It was a business dinner. I told you so. A business dinner that ended after midnight, he noted, without looking away. You didn't even respond to my message. I called Laura. Laura sighed, rubbing her temples. Her face was tired, but there was a hint of guilt in it, which Tom noticed, although he was not sure what it meant. I'm sorry, she said, her voice softening. I was busy. We discussed the project then. Well, we just lost track of time. The phone was in my bag, I didn't hear it. Tom looked at her, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Her words sounded plausible, but her evasiveness, her reluctance to look him in the eyes, all this only strengthened his suspicions. He wanted to ask about the cologne. He wanted to say directly that he smelled this foreign smell, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear of hearing an answer he didn't want to know. We lost track of time, he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. It's clear. Laura looked at him. Her gaze became a little softer, but there was still wariness in it. Tom, I'm tired, she said, brushing her hair out of her face. Let's not quarrel, okay? It's been a long day, and I have to get up early tomorrow. He nodded, but his throat tightened at the unspoken words. He wanted to scream, ask why she was acting so strangely, why her cloak smelled like someone else's cologne, why can't she just be honest? But instead, he simply said, Go to bed. I'm still sitting. Laura looked at him as if she wanted to add something, but changed her mind. She nodded, picked up her bag, and headed towards the stairs leading to the bedroom. Her steps were quiet, but each of them resonated in Tom's head like the blow of a hammer. He returned to the chair, his gaze fell on the bottle of beer, but he did not take it. Instead, he stared at Laura's cloak, still hanging by the door. The smell of cologne, although faint, now seemed loudest in the room. He closed his eyes, trying to convince himself that it didn't mean anything. Maybe she was just standing too close to Ryan. Maybe it was the waiter or someone else in the restaurant. But the voice in his head, the one he had been trying to drown out all evening, whispered, You know what this means? Tom leaned back in his chair, feeling tiredness rolling over him. But the dream was as far away as the truth. He sat in the dark, listening to the house slowly fall into silence, trying to figure out when their lives began to fall apart. The morning light in the Chicago suburbs was cold and gray, as if the sky had decided to reflect the mood in Tom and Laura's home. The kitchen, usually filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, today smelled only of toast, which Laura mechanically toasted while standing at the stove. Tom walked in with a mug in his hand and stood watching her. She was dressed in a simple white blouse and trousers, but her face, devoid of last night's makeup, looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. He wanted to say something light to diffuse the atmosphere, but the words got stuck in his throat. It was a hard night. Tom hardly slept, lying in bed next to Laura, but feeling that there was a whole abyss between them. The smell of cologne from her cloak still haunted him like a ghost, and he couldn't help thinking about what happened in the restaurant. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, that he was making things up, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura laughing at the table with Ryan, her eyes sparkling, her hand touching his sleeve. "Good morning," he said finally, trying to keep his voice neutral. He placed the mug on the counter and began pouring coffee, although his stomach was too tight to drink. Laura turned around. Her movements were sharp, almost irritated. She glanced at him briefly, then returned to the toast, turning it over with more force than necessary. "Morning," she answered, her voice as dry as yesterday's crust of bread. "You're early today." Tom shrugged, leaning against the counter. He looked at her, trying to find something familiar in her face, something that would remind him of the Laura he knew. But she seemed distant, closed, as if an invisible wall had grown between them. "I couldn't sleep," he said, taking a sip of coffee. The hot liquid burned his tongue, but he barely noticed. "You came back late yesterday. Everything is fine." Laura froze, her hand holding the knife with which she was spreading the butter stopped. She looked at him, and something flashed in her eyes: irritation, fatigue, and maybe guilt. Tom couldn't make it out. "Okay, Tom," she replied, her tone harsher than he expected. "I told you, we worked. I don't understand why you're starting again." Tom felt his jaw tighten. He placed the mug on the counter, trying to control himself. He didn't want a quarrel, didn't want everything to slide back into shouting and silence, but her evasiveness, her irritation, all this only added fuel to the fire. "I'm not starting," he said, trying to speak calmly. "I just asked. You returned after midnight, Laura. I was worried." Laura snorted, putting the knife down. She turned to him, crossing her arms, her green eyes sparkling. "Worried?" she asked, her voice full of sarcasm. "Or did you check? You've been calling all evening, Tom. I was busy. It's called work." Tom felt something hot boiling in his chest. He took a step closer. His voice became lower, but firmness appeared in it. "A job that smells like men's cologne?" He blurted out before he could stop himself. He immediately regretted his words, but it was too late. Laura froze, her face turned pale, and then her cheeks flushed. She looked at him, her eyes narrowed, and they flashed a mixture of anger and something else that Tom could not recognize. "What did you say?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was a sense of threat in it. "Are you serious? Were you spying on me?" "I wasn't spying," he replied, raising his hands as if in defense. "I smelled it, Laura, on your cloak. This is not my cologne, and you returned at 2 in the morning. What should I think?" Laura laughed, but the laughter was harsh, almost hysterical. She shook her head, brushing her hair out of her face, her movements nervous. "God, Tom, this is just funny," she said, but her voice was shaking. "Do you really think that what? Do I run to restaurants and cheat on you? It was a business dinner. We were sitting in a crowded room next to a bunch of people. Maybe someone sprayed on cologne, I don't know." Tom looked at her, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Her words sounded logical, but her reaction too violent, too defensive, only increased his suspicions. He wanted to believe her, wanted to go back to the time when he did not doubt her every word, but something inside him did not allow him to do this. "You could have just replied to my message," he said, his voice quieter but still painful. "Or at least call. I was sitting here, waiting for you, and you didn't even think to warn me." Laura sighed, her shoulders slumping. She turned away, picking up the knife again, but her hands were shaking, and she simply put it back. "I've been busy, Tom," she said, her voice quieter but still irritated. I can't check my phone every minute. Ryan. He demanded that we finalize everything down to the smallest detail. This is important to me, for my career. Tom nodded, but his throat tightened. Ryan. Again, this name, pronounced with the same light intonation that made him feel out of place. He wanted to ask who Ryan was, why he was so important, why Laura was spending so much time on him, but he knew that would only make things worse. I understand, he said finally, although it was not true. He didn't understand. He didn't understand why she had changed so much, why she was so distant, why he felt like a stranger in his own home. Laura looked at him, her gaze softened, but there was still wariness in it. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but changed her mind. Instead, she took the toast and began to chew it, although it was obvious that she was only doing this to keep her hands busy. I need to get ready, she said, swallowing a bite. I have another meeting today. With Ryan and the team. Tom felt his heart clench. He nodded, not trusting his voice. He watched her clear the plate, watch her walk toward her bag, watch her avoid his gaze. The cold between them was almost tangible, like a winter wind that chills to the bone. Have a nice day, he said as she headed for the door. And you, she answered without turning around. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, and Tom was left alone in the kitchen. He looked at his mug of cold coffee, at the toast she had left on the counter, at the empty space where Laura had just stood. His thoughts circled around the same thing. She was hiding something. He didn't know what it was, but the feeling was stronger than him, like an instinct that couldn't be ignored. He took the phone, opened their correspondence, and stared at her last message. Busy. We'll talk in the evening. He wanted to write to her, wanted to ask what was happening, but his fingers froze over the screen. Instead, he threw the phone on the counter and rubbed his face with his hands, feeling tired and anxiety merged into one heavy mass. Tom knew that this couldn't go on. He couldn't live with this coldness, with these suspicions, with this feeling that his marriage was falling apart. But he also knew that the truth, whatever it was, might be worse than his worst guesses. Dusk has fallen over the Chicago suburbs, turning the sky a deep indigo. The only lights in Tom and Laura's house were the kitchen lamps, casting a warm but deceptively cozy light onto the wooden table at which they sat. Dinner frozen pizza reheated in the oven was largely untouched. Laura picked at a piece of crust, her eyes glued to the plate, as if she was afraid to look up. Tom, sitting opposite him, clutched his fork so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The silence between them was as thick as smoke, and every breath she took only increased the tension. Tom spent the whole day in the office, but his thoughts were far from drawings and calculations. The morning conversation with Laura, her harshness, her evasiveness, all this was spinning in his head like a broken record. He tried to concentrate, but the image of her cloak, soaked in someone else's cologne, and her cold answer, busy, haunted him. By evening his patience had run out. He knew he couldn't pretend everything was fine, couldn't sit and wait for her to tell her what was going on. If anything was going to happen, it was going to happen today. Laura, he began, his voice low, but there was steel in it. He put down his fork and looked at her, trying to catch her eye. We need to talk. Laura froze, her fingers clenching the pizza crust. She slowly raised her eyes, and a mixture of fatigue and wariness flashed in her gaze. About what? She asked, her tone cautious, as if she already knew where he was going with this. If this is about yesterday again, then I've already said everything. Tom felt irritation boil in his chest. Her words, her attempt to immediately close the topic, only added fuel to the fire. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. No, Laura, you didn't say anything, he replied, his voice getting louder, although he was still trying to control himself. You came back after midnight, smelling like someone else's cologne, and all I got was, we worked. I'm not a fool. What's happening? Laura put down the pizza. Her movements were abrupt. She crossed her arms, her green eyes narrowed, and anger flared in them. God, Tom, are you serious? She said, her voice shaking with irritation. Are you talking about this cologne again? I explained a restaurant, a lot of people, someone standing nearby. What do you want me to do? Did I take my coat to the dry cleaner so you would stop suspecting me? Tom shook his head, his jaw clenching. Her words sounded logical, but her tone, her defensive posture, all this only strengthened his doubts. He couldn't hold back any longer. I want you to be honest, Laura, he said, his voice becoming firmer. You spend all your time with that Ryan guy. Dinners, meetings, endless conversations about how smart and charismatic he is. Do you think I don't notice how you smile when you talk about him? What's going on between you? Laura stood up abruptly, her chair creaking on the floor. Her face turned red and her eyes sparkled with anger. Nothing is happening, Tom, she almost shouted, her voice echoing off the walls of the kitchen. You're paranoid. You take some nonsense, a smell, a late return, and build a whole conspiracy theory out of it. Ryan is my colleague. We are working on a project that could change my career. And you see something dirty in this. Tom stood up too, his heart pounding. He took a step towards her, but stopped, feeling emotions overwhelm him. Paranoid? He asked, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Laura, you came back at 2 in the morning. You haven't answered a single message from me, not a single call. And now you're standing here yelling at me like it's my fault for worrying. If it's just a job, why are you acting this way? Why can't you just look me in the eyes and tell me there's nothing between you? Laura laughed, but the laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. She turned away, running her hands through her hair, her movements nervous, almost desperate. Because it's humiliating, Tom, she said, turning to him. Her eyes sparkled, not from tears, but from anger. Do I have to make excuses for doing my job? Because I have a colleague with whom I have dinner to discuss a project. Do you really think I'm like that? Why am I running after Ryan while you're sitting at home? Tom looked at her, his chest heaving with heavy breathing. Her words hit him like stones, but they did not extinguish his doubts, they only fueled them. He took a step closer, his voice became quieter, but there was pain in it. I don't know what to think, Laura, he said, his eyes searching hers. You have changed. You don't tell me about your life anymore. You close yourself off, you. You look at me like I'm a stranger. And this Ryan, he's everywhere. In your every conversation, in your every day. If it's just a job, why do I feel like I'm losing you? Laura froze, her anger seeming to subside for a second. She looked at him, and something flashed in her eyes, maybe guilt, maybe regret. But she quickly looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're not losing me, she said, but her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. You see something that isn't there. I'm tired, Tom. I'm tired of work, of deadlines, of you constantly suspecting me. Maybe it's you who's moving away, not me. Tom felt her words hit him like a slap in the face. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words got stuck in his throat. He looked at her clenched fists, at her tense pose, and suddenly felt infinitely tired. He didn't want to scream, he didn't want to blame, but he also couldn't pretend that everything was fine. If I'm wrong, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper, then just tell me. Look me in the eye and tell me there's nothing between you and Ryan, and I will believe it. Laura looked at him, her eyes met his, but she immediately looked away. Her silence was louder than any words, and Tom felt his heart clench. I'm not going to play these games, she said, her voice as cold as the winter wind. I told you the truth. If you don't believe me, that's your problem, not mine. She turned and headed towards the stairs. Her steps were fast, almost running. Tom looked after her, feeling the kitchen getting colder, despite the warm light of the lamps. He wanted to run after her, wanted to grab her hand, make her talk, but his legs seemed rooted to the floor. He sank into a chair, his gaze falling on the untouched pizza, on Laura's empty mug, on her place at the table, which now seemed infinitely far away. The quarrel did not resolve anything, it only deepened the crack between them. And in this silence, in this cold, Tom realized that his suspicions had not gone away. On the contrary, they have become stronger, like a fire that is just beginning to flare up. The rain pattered against the windows of their suburban home, drowning out all sound except the heavy breathing of Tom and Laura standing across from each other in the living room. The light from the floor lamp cast long shadows on the walls, making the room look like a scene from some dark play. Tom stood by the fireplace, his hands clenched into fists, and Laura sat on the edge of the sofa, her face pale and her eyes red from the tears she was holding back. Their last fight, which broke out an hour ago in the kitchen, left behind only the ashes of unspoken accusations and pain. But Tom was not going to back down. He felt that the truth, whatever it was already close, and he could no longer live in this fog of suspicion. He spent the whole day in painful anticipation. After the morning conversation, when Laura left again with a cold, "See you in the evening," Tom could not concentrate on work. His thoughts swirled around her evasive answers, her irritation, her refusal to look him in the eyes. He knew something was wrong, and the knowledge was eating away at him from the inside like acid. Returning home, he found Laura at dinner, a lonely plate of soup, which she ate in silence without raising her eyes. His attempt at conversation had escalated into an argument again, and now they were here in the living room, on the brink of something irreversible. "Laura," Tom said, his voice hoarse with tension. He turned to her, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and despair. "I can't do it anymore. You're lying to me, I know it. Just tell the truth. What's going on between you and Ryan?" Laura clenched, her fingers digging into the pillow she held in her lap. She opened her mouth to answer, but her voice wavered, and she fell silent. Her gaze darted to the window, where the rain was running down the glass like tears she had yet to shed. "I'm not lying," she said finally, but her voice was weak, almost unconvincing. "How many times should I repeat? It's work, Tom. Job." Tom stepped closer, his fists unclenched, but his body was still tense, like a taut string. "Job?" he asked, his voice becoming louder. "You come back after midnight, smell like his cologne, don't answer my calls, and then yell at me when I ask what's going on. This is not work, Laura. It's something different, and I want to know what." Laura jumped up from the sofa, her pillow falling to the floor. Her face contorted with anger, but panic flashed in her eyes. "You are unbearable," she shouted, her voice trembling. "You take every little thing and turn it into proof. I'm tired of this, Tom. I'm tired of your suspicions, of your control. Maybe it's you who's ruining our marriage, not me." Tom felt her words hit him, but he didn't back down. He took another step, his eyes were glued to her face, and at that moment he saw what he was looking for: a crack in her defense, a slight trembling in her lips, fear in her eyes. "If I'm wrong," he said, his voice becoming quieter, but there was steel in it, "then why can't you look me in the eyes? Why are you shaking, Laura? What are you hiding?" Laura froze, her breathing became ragged. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears, and for a second it seemed like she was going to scream again, accusing him of being paranoid again. But instead, her shoulders slumped and she buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. "Laura," Tom began, but his voice broke off. He felt his heart clench, as if someone was squeezing him in a vice. He knew what was about to happen. He knew that the truth that he so wanted to hear could destroy everything. Laura lowered her hands, her face wet with tears. She looked at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes that Tom involuntarily took a step back. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible, broken like glass. "Do you want the truth? I slept with Ryan." Tom froze. The world around him seemed to stop. The rain outside the window, the ticking of the clock, even his own breathing, everything disappeared, leaving only her words, sounding like an echo in his head. He looked at her tear-stained face, at her trembling hands, and could not believe that this was real. This was not Laura, not his wife, not the woman with whom he shared 7 years of his life. It was someone else, a stranger, an unknown person. "What? What did you say?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if the words were having trouble getting through his throat. Laura sobbed, her hands clenched into fists, and she lowered her gaze, unable to bear it. "It was one time," she said, her voice shaking. "Yesterday, after dinner, I don't know how it happened, Tom. We drank, we talked, and I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean it." Tom felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He stepped back, his back resting against the fireplace, and he grabbed the shelf to keep from falling. His world, his life, everything he believed in was collapsing like a house of cards. He looked at Laura, at her tears, at her despair, and felt nothing but emptiness. "You," he began, but his voice broke. Laura nodded, her face contorted in pain. She stepped towards him, her hands reaching out to him, but he stepped back, raising his hand to stop her. "Don't," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "Don't touch me." Laura froze, her hands hanging in the air. She sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand, but the tears continued to flow down her cheeks. "Tom, please," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me. It was a mistake, I swear. I love you, I." "Don't say that," Tom cut her off, his voice becoming louder, almost a scream. "Don't you dare say you love me after the way you did." He turned, his eyes falling on the photograph on the mantelpiece, their wedding photo, laughing and holding each other with Lake Michigan in the background. This photograph, this moment now seemed like a lie, a mockery. He turned away, unable to look at her. "Tom, please," Laura said, her voice full of despair. "Let's talk, I'll explain." "Explain?" he asked, turning to her. His eyes were full of pain, but there was no longer anger in them, only emptiness. "What can you explain, Laura? You slept with him. You ruined everything." He walked past her, heading towards the stairs. Laura grabbed his hand. Her fingers were cold, but he pulled away without looking at her. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here," he answered without turning around. "I sleep in the guest room." Laura sobbed, but did not follow him. Tom walked up the stairs, each step resounding in his chest like a blow. He entered the guest room, closed the door, and sat down on the bed without turning on the light. The rain was still hammering on the windows, but he couldn't hear it. He heard nothing but her words in his head. "I slept with Ryan." These words were like a knife stabbed into his heart, and he knew that this wound would never heal. The darkness of the guest room was as thick as ink, and Tom lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, which he could barely see in the faint light of the street lamp shining through the curtains. The rain stopped, leaving behind only silence, broken by the occasional noise of passing cars. He didn't sleep for a minute, his thoughts swirling in an endless whirlpool of pain, anger, and disbelief. Laura's confession, her tears, her words, "I slept with Ryan," ate into his mind like poison, poisoning every attempt to find peace. His world, so familiar and reliable, collapsed overnight, and now he was trying to figure out what to do with the rubble. He rolled onto his side, his gaze falling on the digital clock on his bedside table. 4:37 a.m. Images of their life together flashed through his mind, their first meeting in college, when Laura spilled coffee on his textbook and laughed. Their wedding, where she danced barefoot in the rain. Their disputes, their reconciliations, their plans for the future, which now seemed like a mockery. He tried to find the moment when everything went wrong, but he couldn't. Maybe it was a long time ago, and he just didn't notice. Or maybe it was one night, one mistake, as Laura claimed. But that didn't matter anymore. The pain was too great to forgive. By 6 in the morning, Tom was up, his body heavy, as if he had not slept for a week. He went down to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat down at the table, looking at Laura's empty mug still on the counter. He knew he had to make a decision. Staying in this house, in this marriage, with this truth was unbearable. The word divorce first popped into his head at night, and now it seemed like the only way out. He didn't want this, but he didn't see any other way. Laura had destroyed their trust, their connection, and he didn't know how it could be restored. When Laura went down to the kitchen, her steps were quiet, almost hesitant. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were puffy, her hair was disheveled, and her face was pale, without a trace of makeup. She stopped in the doorway, her hands nervously fiddling with the hem of her pajama t-shirt. "Good morning," she said, her voice hoarse, barely audible. She looked at him, but her gaze immediately slid to the side, as if she was afraid of what she would see in his eyes. Tom didn't answer. He took a sip of coffee, feeling the hot liquid burn his throat, but it was nothing compared to the pain in his chest. He looked at her, at the woman he loved, and saw only her betrayal. "Laura," he said finally, his voice was even, but there was a cold determination in it. "I want a divorce." Laura froze, her breathing stopped. She looked at him, her eyes widened, and horror flashed in them. She stepped towards the table, her hands shaking. "Tom, no," she said, her voice filled with panic. "Please don't say that. We can fix this, I swear. It was a mistake, one mistake." Tom shook his head, his gaze firm, although inside he felt his heart breaking. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask how she could, but instead he spoke calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. "This is not just a mistake, Laura," he said, his voice quiet, but there was steel in it. "You destroyed everything. I can't look at you without thinking about what you did. I can't live with this." Laura sobbed, her hands reached out to him, but she stopped when she saw him move away. Her face contorted in pain and tears rolled down her cheeks. "Tom, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I'm to blame. I hate myself for this. But I love you. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us. We can go to a therapist. We can." "That's enough," Tom interrupted her, his voice becoming louder, but he immediately pulled himself together. He stood up, his hands clenched into fists, and he turned away, unable to look at her tears. "You don't understand, Laura. This is not about therapy. It's about trust. I trusted you, and you. You slept with him. You chose him over me." Laura shook her head, her tears dripping onto the floor. She stepped towards him, her voice becoming desperate. "I didn't choose him," she shouted, her voice breaking. "It was stupid, it was. I was drunk, I was confused, I wasn't thinking. But I love you, Tom. You are my life. Please give me a chance to fix this." Tom turned to her, his eyes full of pain, but there was no warmth in them that she had once seen. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, and it was worse than any words. To correct, he asked, his voice as cold as the winter wind, "How will you fix this, Laura? Can you erase this from my head? Can you make sure I don't see you with him every time I close my eyes?" "You can't. Nobody can." Laura covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. She sank into a chair, her voice becoming barely audible. "I don't know how," she whispered, "but I'll try. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't go, Tom. Please." Tom looked at her tears, at her despair, and for a second he wanted to hug her, to tell her that they could handle it. But this thought disappeared as quickly as it appeared. He felt only emptiness, only pain that filled his entire being. He knew he couldn't stay, not with her, not after this. "I'll talk to a lawyer," he said, his voice smooth, almost mechanical. "We'll sort this out. But I can't be here. Not now." Laura raised her head, her eyes full of horror. She stood up, her hands reaching out to him, but he stepped back, raising his hand to stop her. "Tom, no," she said, her voice filled with despair. "Please don't do this. We can." "That's enough, Laura," he snapped, his voice as hard as stone. "I've decided everything." He turned and walked towards the door, his steps heavy, as if he was carrying the whole world on his shoulders. Laura shouted after him, her voice full of pain, but he didn't turn around. He left the kitchen, went up to the guest room and closed the door, leaving her sobs behind. He knew that this was just the beginning. He knew that there would be more pain, more tears, more unanswered questions ahead. But at that moment he felt only one thing. His marriage was over, and there was no turning back. The morning in downtown Chicago was noisy. The sound of car horns, the footsteps of hurrying pedestrians, and the smell of coffee from sidewalk cafes filled the air. Tom walked along the sidewalk, his face unreadable, but inside he felt as if his heart was being crushed under the asphalt. He was heading to the office of a lawyer he had found through a colleague at work. The small red brick building with the sign Murray and Partners looked modest, but Tom wasn't looking for anything pretentious. He needed someone to help him end a marriage that now seemed foreign to him, like an old photograph from another life. A week has passed since the evening when Laura admitted to cheating. A week filled with silence, sleepless nights, and the cold that settled in their house. Tom stayed in the guest room, avoiding Laura as much as possible. Their conversations boiled down to short phrases about everyday trifles: who will pick up the mail, whose turn it is to cook dinner. But every glance, every accidental touch in the corridor was like an electric shock, reminding him of the pain that he could not drown out. The decision to divorce that morning became an anchor for him, the only clear point in the chaos of his emotions. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and old wood. Miss Murray, a woman of about 50 with short gray hair and stern eyes, met him at a massive oak table. Her thin-framed glasses glinted in the lamplight as she opened her notebook and looked at Tom. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice businesslike, but not devoid of sympathy. "Tell me what brought you here. I understand that you want to discuss divorce." Tom nodded, his throat tightening. He wasn't ready to talk about it out loud, but there was nowhere to retreat. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice even. "Yes," he said, his fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of his jacket. I, my wife and I want to get a divorce. She cheated on me and I can't live with it." Miss Murray nodded, her pen moving quickly across the paper. She didn't show surprise or condemnation, and that calmed Tom a little. He expected that he would have to justify himself, to explain, but she just listened. "I understand," she said, looking up. "In Illinois, a divorce can be filed on the basis of irreconcilable differences, which does not require proof of fault on either side. This makes the process easier if you're both on the same page. Does your wife know about your intention?" Tom swallowed, his gaze falling on the table. Laura knew. Her tears, her pleas that morning still sounded in his head, but he couldn't change his mind, couldn't go back to her, knowing that she was with someone else. "Yes," he answered, his voice quiet. "I told her. She, she's against it, but I'm determined." Miss Murray nodded, writing something down on her notepad. "Okay," she said. "We will need to discuss the details. Division of property, possible alimony if you don't have children. Have you thought about this yet?" Tom shook his head. Children. He and Laura wanted children, talked about it, planned it, but after a miscarriage 3 years ago, these conversations died down. Now he was almost grateful that they didn't have a child who would be in the middle of this nightmare. "There are no children," he said. His voice was even, but there was a hint of bitterness in it. "The house is in joint ownership. Cars too. I I don't know how to divide it. I just want this to end." Miss Murray looked at him, her gaze softening. "It's okay, Mr. Davis," she said. "Divorce is hard, and at first everything seems overwhelming. We'll figure it out step by step. I'll prepare the paperwork, and we'll send notice to your wife. If she doesn't agree to a voluntary divorce, the process may drag on, but we can handle it." Tom nodded, but her words barely reached him. He thought about Laura, about how she would react when she received the papers. He saw her tears, her despair, and despite all the pain she caused him, part of him still hated himself for what he was doing. But he couldn't stop. Not now. "Thank you," he said, standing up. I'll contact you if I have any questions." Miss Murray handed him his card and shook his hand, her palm warm and confident. "We'll work it out," she said. "Call when you're ready." Tom walked out of the office, feeling the cold Chicago air burn his face. He stood on the sidewalk, looking at the traffic, and tried to understand what he was feeling. Relief? Emptiness? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Laura sat in her office in the city center, surrounded by glass walls and the hum of colleagues talking. There were printouts of the presentation slides on her desk, but her eyes were glued to the blank computer screen. She couldn't work, couldn't think about anything except Tom and his words, "I want a divorce." These words echoed in her head like a sentence from which she could not escape. She was still in shock. The week passed in a blur. Tears, pleas, attempts to talk to Tom, who now looked at her as if she were a stranger. She tried to hold on, tried to go to work, smiled at her colleagues, but her thoughts were occupied with only one thing: she destroyed their marriage. One night, one mistake, and everything they had spent 7 years building turned to ashes. Ryan entered her. "Ryan," he called, his voice cheerful as always. He stood in the doorway of her office, holding a folder in his hands. Are you ready for today's meeting? The client is waiting for your ideas. Laura flinched, her gaze darting to him. Ryan, the man who caused her nightmare. She looked at him, at his confident smile, at his carefree appearance, and felt anger boiling in her chest. But she suppressed it, forcing herself to nod. Yes, she said, her voice weak, I'm ready. Ryan nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than necessary. Are you okay? He asked, his tone becoming softer. You look unimportant. Laura clenched her hand, her fingers turning white. She wanted to scream, wanted to tell him that because of him her life was falling apart, but instead she just shook her head. It's okay, she lied. It's just a lot of work. Ryan nodded, but doubt flashed in his eyes. He placed the folder on her desk and walked away, leaving her alone. Laura looked at the folder, but her thoughts were far away. She thought about Tom, about his cold voice, about his decision to get a divorce. She knew she had to fight, she had to try to get him back, but part of her was afraid it was too late. The dim light of the November morning filtered through the thick curtains of Laura's bedroom, but she did not notice it. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, where a crack, barely visible, stretched from the corner to the center, like a metaphor for her own life. 2 weeks have passed since Tom announced the divorce, and since then her world has narrowed to this room, to these walls, to the endless cycle of thoughts that haunted her. She had not gotten out of bed for several hours, although the alarm clock on the bedside table had long since gone silent, leaving behind only silence as heavy as her heart. Laura knew she had to go to work. Today was an important presentation for a client, and her team, including Ryan, was waiting for her. But the thought of getting up, getting dressed, putting on makeup, and pretending everything was fine seemed impossible. She turned on her side, her gaze falling on the empty half of the bed where Tom had previously slept. His pillow still had the faint scent of his shampoo, and it was like a knife in his chest. She closed her eyes, but the tears she thought she had already cried began to flow down her cheeks again. Her phone was on the floor, the screen was dark. She hadn't checked it since last night, when she missed 3 calls from a colleague and a text from her friend Kate, who was trying to take her out for coffee. Laura didn't answer. She didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain why her eyes were always red and her voice was shaking. She wanted only one thing: to turn back time, to erase that night with Ryan, to bring Tom back, to return their lives. But this was impossible, and the realization of this drove her into even greater darkness. Laura forced herself to sit up. Her movements were slow, like an old man's. She looked at her reflection in the mirror opposite the bed. Pale face, tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes. She didn't recognize herself. The woman who once gave presentations with ease and laughed at her colleagues' jokes has disappeared. All that was left was a shell full of guilt and pain. She remembered how it all started. Dinner with Ryan, the wine, his smile, his words that made her feel alive, wanted. She hated herself for it. She hated her for giving in, for allowing herself to forget about Tom, about their marriage, about everything that was important. She tried to make excuses to her self-stress, fatigue, loneliness, but these excuses were empty. She had made a choice, and now she was paying for it. Laura stood up, her legs trembling as if she had not walked for several days. She walked into the bathroom, turned on the water, and stared at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. Her fingers squeezed the edges of the sink, and she whispered to herself, "What have you done?" Her voice was hoarse, full of despair. She lowered her head, letting the water roar, drowning out her thoughts. But the silence inside her was louder. She knew she had to do something: call Tom, beg him, go to a therapist, but she didn't have the strength. All she could do was blame herself, replaying that night, that moment when she lost everything, over and over again in her head. Laura returned to the bedroom, took the phone, and opened her correspondence with Tom. The last message was from her, a week ago. "Please, let's talk." He didn't answer. She knew he wouldn't answer, but she still checked every day, hoping for a miracle. There was no miracle. She threw the phone on the bed and sank to the floor, hugging her knees with her hands. Her body shook with silent sobs, but there were almost no tears left. The office noticed her absence. Ryan, sitting in the conference room, looked at Laura's empty chair, his eyebrows furrowed. He turned to his colleague, who was flipping through the slides. "Where is Laura?" he asked, his voice filled with irritation. She was supposed to lead this part. The colleague shrugged, her gaze sympathetic. "She doesn't answer," she said. "I called in the morning. Maybe she's sick." Ryan nodded, but his face became tense. He knew that Laura was not sick. He had seen her in recent days, her aloofness, her empty gaze, her attempts to avoid him. He suspected it had something to do with what happened between them, but he didn't know how to fix it. He tried to talk to her, but she brushed him off every time, going to her office or citing being busy. Now her absence from the presentation threatened to undermine the entire project, and this only increased his feelings of guilt. Laura, sitting on the floor of her bedroom, was not thinking about work. She wasn't thinking about Ryan, about clients, about deadlines. Her world narrowed to pain that filled her entire being. She remembered Tom, his smile, his warm hands, his voice when he said that he loved her. These memories were like knives stabbing into her heart, but she couldn't stop thinking about them. She wanted to fix everything, wanted to bring him back, but didn't know how. She didn't even know if he wanted her to try. Her gaze fell on the photo on the dresser her and Tom on the beach, 2 years ago. They laughed, hugging each other, their faces full of happiness. Laura stood up, her legs trembling, and walked towards the photo. She took it in her hands, her fingers stroking the glass as if it could bring back that moment. But the glass was cold, just like her reality. She put the photo back, her gaze blank. She knew she had to do something, go to work, call a friend, at least leave the house. But instead, she returned to bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and closed her eyes. She didn't want to see the world, didn't want to feel it. She wanted only one thing: to forget, at least for a moment, but even this was inaccessible to her. Laura didn't know how much time had passed when her phone rang again. She didn't move, didn't look at the screen. She knew it wasn't Tom, and if it wasn't him, it didn't matter. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness consume her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was giving up. Not to Tom, not to marriage, but to herself. Snow fell softly outside the window, covering the Chicago suburbs with a thin white blanket that hid the dirt and weariness of the world. Tom stood in the living room of his house, surrounded by cardboard boxes, which he methodically filled with books, clothes, and pieces of his past life. The air smelled of cardboard and dust, and the silence, broken only by the rustle of tape, was almost tangible. It's been a month since he announced his divorce to Laura, and now his decision to move to Denver has become a reality. The offer to work for an engineering firm came unexpectedly, but Tom grabbed it like a life preserver. This was his chance to start again, to leave behind the pain, betrayal, and ghosts of the past. He pulled an old book off the shelf, a tattered copy of The Catcher in the Rye that Laura had given him for their first anniversary. On the inside cover was written in her handwriting, "For Tom, my dreamer. Love you, Laura." His fingers froze, and he felt his throat tighten. He wanted to throw the book away, but instead he carefully placed it in the box, closing the lid as if that would lock away the memories. Packing his things became a ritual of saying goodbye to him, not only to his home, but also to the life he once considered his own. Tom went into the bedroom, which he had not shared with Laura for a long time. Her things were still there, her dress thrown on the chair, her perfume on the dresser, her hairbrush. He tried not to look at them, but each object was like a blow, reminding him of what he had lost. He opened his closet and began putting his shirts into his suitcase, his movements mechanical, but his thoughts chaotic. He thought about Denver, about his new job, about the mountains he had only seen in photographs. He imagined an apartment where there would be no her smell, her voice, her betrayal. But even these thoughts did not bring relief. They were just an empty promise of a future that he could not yet imagine. His phone rang, breaking the silence. Tom looked at the screen. It was his colleague, Mark, who had helped him contact the company in Denver. He answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Hi, Mark," he said, his voice tired but calm. "Tom, old man, how are you?" Mark's voice was cheerful, as if he was calling from another world. "Are you packing your bags yet? Denver is waiting for you." Tom forced himself to smile, although Mark couldn't see it. "Yes, almost," he answered, looking at the boxes. "A couple more days, and I'm ready." "Great," said Mark. "Listen, they've already found an apartment for you. Not far from the office, Mountain View. You'll like it. It's a new start, brother. You made the right choice." Tom nodded, although his heart sank. New start. The words sounded so simple, but he wasn't sure he was ready for them. He thanked Mark, ended the call, and went back to packing. He took from the table a frame with their wedding photograph, Laura in a white dress, he in a suit, both laughing. His hand trembled, and he put the frame back. He couldn't take it with him, but he didn't dare throw it away either. Instead, he put it away in a drawer, as if that would hide the pain. Laura was at work, and Tom was grateful for her absence. Their meetings in the house became unbearable short, tense conversations about who would take the car, how to divide the furniture. She no longer cried, did not beg, but her look, full of guilt and pain, was worse than any tears. Tom knew she was suffering, but his own pain was too great to think about her feelings. He wanted to leave, he wanted to forget, he wanted to become someone else, someone who doesn't know what betrayal is. He walked into the garage, where there were boxes of tools and old things. There was a box with their camping equipment, a tent, sleeping bags, a lantern. He and Laura loved to travel to Wisconsin, camp by the lake, and roast marshmallows over a campfire. These memories were so vivid that Tom could almost smell the smoke and her laughter. He closed the box and pushed it into the corner. This was not his future. His future was in Denver, alone, in a new life that he didn't yet know how to build. When he returned to the living room, his eyes fell on the note taped to the refrigerator. It was a to-do list written by Laura. Buy milk, call the bank, pick up the dry cleaning. Her neat handwriting, her habit of planning everything, it was so familiar, so painful. Tom tore the note and crumpled it, but did not throw it away. He put it in his pocket, as if it could hold a part of her that he was still not ready to let go. By evening, the boxes were almost full. Tom sat down on the sofa, his hands were covered with dust, and his body was tired. He looked at the room that had once been their home and felt like a stranger. Packing his things was not just a physical act. It was saying goodbye to dreams, to hopes, to a love that he thought would last forever. He knew Denver wouldn't erase the pain, but maybe he could breathe a little more freely there. His phone rang again, and this time it was Laura. He looked at the screen, his finger hovering over the answer button. He knew she probably wanted to discuss something practical: bills, paperwork, anything else that connected them. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. He turned off the phone and returned to the boxes, his movements becoming faster, as if he could pack not only his things, but also his past. Denver was waiting, and Tom was ready to go, even if it meant leaving a part of himself behind. The winter wind howled outside the windows, filtering through the cracks of the old house where Laura sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the silence that had become her constant companion. On the table in front of her lay a sheet of paper, covered in her neat handwriting, and an envelope not yet sealed. The light from a single lamp cast soft shadows on her face, emphasizing the dark circles under her eyes and the fatigue that was ingrained in her features. A month has passed since Tom announced his move to Denver, and since then their house has become like a museum of the past, empty, cold, full of memories that no one wanted to touch. Laura knew that Tom was leaving tomorrow. She saw the boxes that he methodically packed, heard him talk on the phone about a new job, about a new apartment. Every step he took was like a blow, reminding her of what she had lost. Her depression that had consumed her in recent weeks still had her in its grip, but today something inside her shifted. She couldn't just sit and watch him leave forever. She had to try, even if it meant facing his coldness, his pain, his hatred. The letter was her last hope. She began writing it at night, when sleep passed her by again. The words flowed slowly, each one laced with guilt, regret, and the love she still felt despite everything. She didn't know if Tom would read her letter, didn't know if it would touch him, but she had to try. It was her way of saying everything that she couldn't express in their last conversations when her tears and pleas only pushed him away. Laura took the letter, her fingers trembling as she reread the lines. Dear Tom, I don't know where to start. I'm sitting in our kitchen where we laughed, argued, planned our future so many times, and all I feel is emptiness. I know it's my fault. I destroyed everything we had, and there are no words that can fix it. But I have to try, because the thought of you leaving and me never telling you this is unbearable. I never meant to hurt you. That night with Ryan was the biggest mistake of my life. I can't explain why this happened. Maybe I was lost. Maybe I was looking for something I was missing. But I know that's no excuse. I betrayed you. I betrayed our marriage. I betrayed everything we believed in. I hate myself for this, Tom. Every day I wake up with this pain, and it doesn't go away. I know that you don't want to see me. You don't want to hear me. I saw it in your eyes, in the way you look away when we accidentally cross paths in the house. But I still love you. I always loved you, even when I was too stupid to show it. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I know I don't deserve it. I ask only one thing. Don't close the door forever. Give me a chance to show that I can be better, that we can be better. I understand why you are leaving. Denver is your way of starting over, and I don't blame you for that. But if you ever feel like you can talk, that you can give me a chance to explain myself, I'll be here. I'll always be here, Tom. With love, Laura. Laura folded the letter, her hands shaking as she sealed the envelope. She wrote down his address in Denver, which she found out after accidentally overhearing his conversation on the phone. She wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing by sending the letter there, but she couldn't leave it here in the house where he could just throw it away. She wanted it to reach him when he was far away, when perhaps his anger had subsided a little. She got up, put on her coat, and went outside. The snow crunched under her boots, and the cold air burned her face. The mailbox was only a few blocks away, but every step felt like a challenge. She held the envelope as if it were her last connection with Tom, her last hope for forgiveness. When she dropped the letter into the box, her heart sank. She knew there probably wouldn't be an answer, but still part of her clung to this tiny possibility. Returning home, Laura sat down on the sofa, her gaze falling on the empty space where their wedding photo had previously stood. Tom put it away, and it was another reminder of how far they had come. She closed her eyes, trying to remember his smile, his warmth, but all she saw was his cold gaze, his words, "I want a divorce." She knew she deserved this pain, but that didn't make it any easier. The next day she went to work, but her thoughts were far away. Colleagues noticed her detachment, her silence, but no one asked. Even Ryan, who had once been so close, now kept his distance, as if sensing her fragility. Laura sat at her desk, looking at her computer screen but didn't see the words. She thought about the letter, about how it was flying across the country to the person she had loved and lost. She waited for an answer, although she knew that he would not come. Every day she checked her mail, her phone, hoping for a message, a call, anything. But silence was her only answer, and every day she sank deeper into the realization that Tom was gone forever. Her letter was a cry into the void, and now she could only live with this echo. The Colorado mountains dominated the horizon, their snow-capped peaks shining under the cold Denver sun. Tom stood on the balcony of his new apartment, holding a mug of coffee, and looked at the city that was now his home. The streets below hummed with the morning bustle. Cars, pedestrians, cyclists, everything moved in a rhythm that seemed alien to him, but at the same time promised new life. A month has passed since he left Chicago, leaving behind his home, memories, and Laura. Denver was his refuge, but even here the pain of betrayal followed him like a shadow that could not be shaken. His apartment was small but cozy, light walls, wooden floors, several boxes that he had not yet unpacked. He furnished it minimally: a sofa, a table, a bed, as if he was afraid that too many things would tie him to this place. A job at an engineering firm was exactly what he needed. Challenging projects, long hours, coworkers who didn't ask questions about his background. He immersed himself in drawings and calculations as if in a life preserver, but every evening, returning to an empty apartment, he was faced with silence that reminded him of Laura. Tom took a sip of coffee, his gaze sliding over the mountains. He tried to love Denver, tried to find solace in it. His colleague, Jake, a cheerful guy with a beard and tattoos, took him on a couple of hikes and to a local bar, where they drank craft beer and talked football. Jake and his girlfriend Sarah became the first people Tom could call friends here, although he still kept his distance. They didn't know about Laura, about the divorce, about how his heart was still bleeding, and he was grateful for that. Their laughter, their lightness helped him breathe, but could not fill the emptiness inside. He returned to the living room, put the mug on the table, and began to get ready for work. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, the screen glowing with a new voicemail notification. Tom froze, his hand hovering over the device. He knew who it was from. Laura had called several times since he left, but he never answered. He only read half of her letter, which arrived a week ago, before crumpling it up and throwing it away. Her words, apologies, pleas, promises were like salt in the wound, and he did not want to hear them. But the voicemail was new, and his finger hovered over the play button. He picked up the phone, his heart speeding up. Her name flashed on the screen, Laura. He looked at him like he was a bomb that could explode at any moment. Part of him wanted to listen, to see what she had to say, but the other part, the part that still saw her with Ryan, still felt the knife in his back, was stronger. He hit delete without opening the message and threw the phone on the table as if it had burned his hand. Enough, he muttered under his breath, rubbing his face. He didn't want her voice in his head. He didn't want her tears, her guilt. He wanted to move forward, even if it meant going alone. Tom put on his jacket and walked out of the apartment, the cold Denver air hitting his face. He walked towards the office, his steps fast, as if he could escape his thoughts. A new project awaited him at work, a bridge across a local river, complex and requiring full concentration. He immersed himself in it, discussing the details with Jake and their boss, but every time his eyes fell on the phone, he felt a pang of anxiety. What if she calls again? What if he can't resist and responds? In the evening, Jake suggested going to a bar after work, and Tom agreed, hoping that the noise and laughter would drown out his thoughts. The bar was packed, smelled of hops and fried potatoes, and had live music playing in the background. Jake and Sarah sat across from them, talking about their recent trip to the Rocky Mountains, and Tom tried to listen, nodding in the right places. But his thoughts kept returning to Laura, to her voice, which he never heard. "Hey, Tom, are you with us?" Jake asked, his eyebrows raised. He held a glass of beer in his hand. His smile was light, but there was curiosity in his eyes. Tom forced himself to smile as he took a sip from his glass. "Yes, everything is fine," he lied. "I'm just tired. This project is exhausting." Sarah leaned closer, her dark hair falling over her shoulder. "You are sure?" she asked, her voice soft. "You sometimes look like you're somewhere else." Tom swallowed, his fingers tightening around the glass. He wanted to tell them, everything about Laura, about the betrayal, about how he was trying to piece himself back together. But instead, he shook his head. "Just getting used to Denver," he said, his voice level. "New life, you know." Jake nodded, but his gaze was attentive, as if he saw more than Tom wanted to show. They changed the subject to talk about plans for the weekend, and Tom was grateful for that. He laughed at Jake's jokes, nodded when Sarah suggested going on a hike, but inside he felt distant, as if he was looking at everything from the outside. When he returned home, night had already fallen on the city, and the stars were twinkling over the mountains. He turned on the light in the apartment, and his gaze fell on the box, which he never opened packed. There were things from Chicago books, photographs, little things that he didn't dare touch. He knew that there might be something from Laura among them, and this thought stopped him. He turned away, deciding that he would take it apart later when he was ready, if he's ever ready. Tom went to bed, but sleep did not come. He looked at the ceiling, listening to the wind knocking on the windows, and thought about Laura. Her voicemail, which he deleted, still haunted him. What did she want to say? Apologize again? Beg? He didn't know, and maybe that was for the best. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine Denver, the mountains, his new life. But all he saw was her face, her tears, her betrayal. And he knew that despite the new friends, the new job, the new apartment, the pain was still with him, and it was not going to go away. The cold Chicago air rushed in through the slightly open window of the therapist's office, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and the distant noise of the city. Laura sat on a soft gray sofa, her hands nervously fiddling with the edge of a woolen scarf that she had never taken off. Opposite her, in a high-backed chair, sat Dr. Allison Clark, a woman in her 40s with warm eyes and a calm smile that seemed to relieve any tension. But Laura did not feel relieved. Her chest was compressed, as if someone had placed a stone on it, and every breath was difficult. It had been 2 months since Tom had left for Denver, and her life, once full of color, was now gray as the winter sky outside. She started going to Dr. Clark 3 weeks ago, at the urging of her friend Kate, who was tired of seeing her in this state. Laura resisted, claiming that she could handle it on her own, but her depression only deepened. She almost never left the house except to go to work, where her presence was rather formal. She stopped running, stopped meeting friends, stopped smiling. Her world had narrowed to pain, guilt, and endless regrets, and she knew she couldn't continue to live like this. Laura, Dr. Clark began, her voice soft but firm, like an anchor in a storm. Tell me how this week went. How did you feel? Laura swallowed, her gaze falling on her hands. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to delve into this mess of emotions, but the silence was even worse. She cleared her throat, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. Emptiness, she said finally, her fingers clenching the scarf. I think about Tom all the time. About what I did. About how things could have been different. I wrote him a letter and sent it, but he didn't answer. And I know he won't answer. But I'm still waiting. Dr. Clark nodded, her pen hovering over her notepad. She didn't rush Laura, giving her space to let the words come out. It's hard, she said, her voice full of sympathy. You sent the letter, and it was a big step. But you say that you are waiting for an answer, although you know that most likely there will not be one. Why is this so important to you? Laura shook her head, her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hold back. She hated crying here, hated feeling so vulnerable, but the tears flowed anyway. Because I want him to know how sorry I am, she said, her voice shaking. I want him to understand that I'm not the one who did this. I don't know who I was that night, but it wasn't me. I love him, Dr. Clark. I've always loved him. And now he's gone, and I don't know how to live without him. Dr. Clark leaned a little closer, her gaze attentive but not judgmental. You blame yourself for what happened, she said, and this feeling of guilt became a part of you. But let's try to look at this from the other side. What would you tell yourself if you could go back to that moment before everything happened? Laura closed her eyes, her breathing becoming ragged. She imagined herself in a restaurant with Ryan, a glass of wine in her hand. She saw his smile, heard his words, felt the warmth that then seemed so necessary, and she hated herself for it. I would tell myself, stop, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I would say it's not worth it. That Tom is all I have. That one night is not worth 7 years. But I didn't stop, and now I've lost him. Dr. Clark nodded, her pen skimming the paper again. You made a mistake, Laura, she said, and this mistake had consequences. But you can't change the past. You can only work with what you have now. What do you want for yourself? Not for Tom, not for your marriage, but for yourself. Laura looked at her, her eyes full of pain. She didn't think about herself, didn't think about what she wanted. All she saw was Tom, his departure, his silence. She shook her head, her voice filled with despair. I don't know, she said. I don't know what I want. I just want this pain to go away. I want to stop seeing his face every time I close my eyes. I want to stop hating myself. Dr. Clark smiled, but her smile was sad. This is the beginning, she said. Admitting that you want to stop hating yourself is a step, but you need to give yourself time, Laura. You can't force Tom to come back, and you can't erase what happened. but you can start to build a life where you are kind to yourself. What could this mean for you? Laura clutched her scarf as her gaze fell on the window, where snow began to fall, covering the city in a thin layer. She thought about running, about the park where she had once found peace. She thought about her friend Kate, about her offer to meet. She thought about the work that once brought her joy. But all this seemed so far away, so unattainable. I, I loved running, she said finally, her voice quiet. It made me feel free. Maybe I could start again. Dr. Clark nodded, her eyes lighting up. This is a good start, she said. Running can be a way to return to yourself. What else? Laura shrugged, her gaze blank. I don't know, she said. I can't think about the future. All I think about is Tom. I know he won't come back. I see this in his silence, in the fact that he does not answer my calls or my letter. But I can't stop regretting it. I can't stop thinking that if I were different, if I hadn't. She fell silent, her voice breaking. Dr. Clark leaned closer, her voice softer. Laura, regrets are part of the process, she said. But they can't be all you live for. You made a mistake, but you are not your mistake. You are a person who learns, who grows. What would you say to Tom if he were here? Laura closed her eyes, her tears flowing again. She imagined Tom, his face, his eyes, which once looked at her with love, but now with coldness. I would say, I'm sorry, she whispered. I would say that I love him, that I will always love, and that I hope that he will be happy even if it is without me. Dr. Clark nodded, her gaze filled with warmth. It's beautiful, she said, and this is also a step. Maybe in time you will be able to tell this to yourself that you deserve happiness, even after everything. Laura didn't answer. She looked at the snow outside the window, her thoughts were far away. She knew Dr. Clark was right. She knew she had to move forward, but her regrets were like an anchor pulling her down. She understood that Tom would not return, but this truth only intensified her pain. She wanted to fight, she wanted to find herself, but for now all she could do was sit in this office, holding on to her scarf, and hope that one day she would be able to breathe without this heaviness in her chest. Spring has arrived in Denver, bringing with it warm winds and the bright colors of flowering trees that enliven the city's streets. Tom walked along a path in a park surrounded by mountains whose peaks still bore traces of winter snow. His backpack swayed slightly on his shoulders, and in his hand he held a bottle of water, which he put to his lips from time to time. It had been 4 months since he left Chicago, and now, looking up at the clear sky and feeling the rhythm of his steps, he was beginning to feel something akin to peace. Not happiness, not joy, but a quiet acceptance of loneliness, which became his new companion. His life in Denver took shape. His job at an engineering firm consumed most of his time. Projects, meetings, drawings, it all gave him the purpose, the structure he craved after the chaos of his divorce. His friends, Jake and Sarah, became closer, although he still did not share his story with them. They went hiking, drank beer in local bars, laughed at stupid jokes, and these moments were like islands of light in his still dark inner world. But at night, when he returned to his apartment, the pain of Laura's betrayal still rolled in, although not as sharply as before. It became the background, like the noise of a distant train, which is audible but no longer disturbs sleep. Tom stopped at the edge of the path, looking down at the valley below. He took out his phone to take a photo and noticed a notification about a new email. His heart sank for a second. He knew it could be from Laura. She no longer called or left voicemails, but her letters arrived from time to time. He didn't open them. Each letter was like a bridge to the past, which he tried to leave behind. He brushed away the notification without reading it and put the phone in his pocket. He didn't hate her, didn't wish her harm, but he couldn't let her words come into his life again. His thoughts were interrupted by Jake's voice, who caught up with him, breathing heavily. "Dude, you're like a mountain goat," Jake said, wiping sweat from his forehead. His beard glistened from the sun, and his smile was contagious. "Give me a minute, I'm out of shape." Tom smiled, feeling light for the first time that day. Maybe less beer, more running. He teased, taking a sip of water. Jake laughed, slapping him on the shoulder. That's why I love you, he said. Listen, Sarah wants to have a barbecue next week. Will you come? Tom nodded, his gaze returning to the mountains. Of course, he said. Sounds great. He spoke sincerely, but part of him still felt distant. He was building a new life, finding peace in solitude, but somewhere deep inside he knew that part of him remained in Chicago, with Laura, with that life that no longer existed. He didn't want to go back, but he couldn't forget completely. In Chicago, spring was different damp, with the smell of wet asphalt and cherry blossoms that Laura noticed while running in the park. She returned to running as she had promised Dr. Clark, and every morning she forced herself to put on her running shoes and go outside. Running didn't bring her the joy it used to, but it gave her rhythm, structure, something to hold on to. Her depression was still with her, but she learned to live with her like a neighbor who couldn't be evicted. The sessions with Dr. Clark became less frequent, but Laura continued to go because she knew that without them she would drown again. She learned to talk about her guilt, her pain, about Tom, without dissolving into tears. She understood that he would not return, that her letters, her calls, her pleas did not change his decision. This truth was like a knife, but it no longer cut as deep. Laura learned to live with her, learned to breathe, despite her broken heart. She sat in her office, looking at the computer screen where the project she had finally begun to finish was open. Work became her anchor again, even though Ryan was no longer part of her team. She asked to be transferred to another department, and her request was granted without question. She couldn't see him without remembering that night, without feeling her stomach clench with shame. Now she was working with a new team, and it helped her feel like she was moving forward, albeit slowly. Her friend Kate walked into the office holding 2 cups of coffee. Break? Kate asked. Her smile was warm, but there was concern in her eyes. Laura nodded, pushing her laptop away. Yes, of course, she said, taking the coffee. Her voice was quieter than before, but there was a slight confidence in it that hadn't been there months ago. They sat by the window, looking at the passers-by hurrying along the sidewalk. Kate looked at Laura, her eyebrows furrowed slightly. You look better, she said. I don't want to push, but are you okay? Laura took a sip of coffee, her gaze slid to the street. She wasn't fine, not completely, but she was alive, and that was something. I'm learning, she said, her voice soft. I still think about him, Kate. I still regret it, but I'm trying not to drown in it. Kate nodded, her hand resting on Laura's. You are strong, she said. I know it hurts, but you can handle it. And I'm proud of you. Laura smiled, but her smile was sad. She was grateful to Kate, grateful for the support, for the fact that someone still believed in her. But her heart remained broken, and she knew that this crack would never fully heal. She thought about Tom, about his new life in Denver, about how he might have found peace. She wanted him to be happy, even if it meant he was happy without her. But the thought still burned like an open wound. She went back to work, her fingers running over the keyboard again, but her mind was elsewhere. She imagined Tom walking through the mountains, laughing with new friends, living a life without her. And she learned to live her life where he was not there either. It was hard, it was painful, but she continued to go, step by step, because there was no other way. Laura looked at her reflection in the window, a pale face, but with a slight blush from the morning run. She was not the same woman she used to be, and perhaps she never would be. But she was here, she was breathing, and maybe that was enough to start. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.